Boa tarde e bem-vindos de volta. Como não tivemos tempo para fazer a conclusão, eu chamo...
It's always very difficult to make some conclusions of a complex, let's say, discussion, but at the same time it was a very fascinating morning with a lot of interesting comments and nuances on this topic. So I try to summarize all this in a very short set of slides, so I'm not going to take a lot of your time. I don't know where the... you can switch? Okay, perfect. So if I can have the next slide, I would say that, again, one thing has been very clear from this morning's session is that there is a very large set of cooperation channels that have been identified to establish links between science and industry. This can be formal channels, which I have tried to summarize here. It can also be more informal ones. But what is clear, and this came from most of the presentations, is that overcoming these kind of obstacles and using up all these kind of channels that are on the screen, it is a win-win, high-impact policy. However, as I was just discussing with Dominic Gelek, it is true that it is hard to prove quantitatively still that there is a clear impact from science-business cooperation, because we have a lot of different channels, the ones that you have there, but we have also a lot of different indicators. And depending on the indicators that you choose, you see certain trends and certain impacts than with others. So I think we need a little bit more of work as well on the indicator side, particularly moving towards the more microdata-based type of indicators and a little bit away from the more traditional kind of broader sense indicators. And also another point I wanted to make is that improving science-business links is not something that is going to happen from one day to the other. So it is not that it's not a policy that you can just enact today and you know that in 2 years from now you're going to have a perfectly well-connected economy in terms of science-business links. I think it is a long-term sustainable policy in investments and long-term sustainable policy in reforms of the science and innovation system, but also in ensuring an appropriate policy mix to do a structural upgrade of your economy that is going to take you to better science-business links. If I can have the next slide, I have tried to summarize here the barriers and incentives, but looking more at the incentive side, because when I was writing the slide looking at barriers, it looked a little bit negative. So I put it on the incentive side to turn it into more of a positive tone. And the first thing that was mentioned by many of the speakers was that there is a little bit of a need to look at the culture of cooperation. There is a number of issues that are out there in terms of, let's say, perceptions from the science or from the industry side about science-business cooperation, and there is a lot of communication efforts that need to be done there. But also there is a need to embrace uncertainty. Minister Aitor was talking about the developments in innovation dynamics. So we have, as I was pointing out before, some innovation setup nowadays that is completely different from the one of 10 or 20 years ago. Whether you look at the STI outlook of the OECD and all the mega trends that are inside the report, whether you look at artificial intelligence, robotics, etc., you will see that innovation is much more complex, it is much faster, and it is much more concentrated. And therefore, this is leading to some uncertainty in the system, it's leading to obstacles to innovation creation and diffusion that need to be addressed. Then we have, of course, another big block, which is about talking the same language. So science and business needs to be somehow speaking the same kind of language. And this is something which is at the moment not fully happening. Ana Costa Freitas and Thomas Bierre were both referring to these issues. But also we need institutional flexibility, and I'm sorry I'm following a different order because I forgot to upload the changes that I was making. But we need some institutional flexibility to permit this kind of science-business cooperation. So we need to, if we're a public research organization or a university, we need to have in place the proper incentive mechanisms for researchers' careers to recognize and reward experience in the private sector. And the same way, if we're in business, we should have, enough, let's say, leeway to engage in relations with universities without seeing them, as some kind of a totem of basic science. Another issue that came up was the need to have a critical, well-developed, let's say, human resources base with enough critical mass in PhDs, so that we can have this knowledge transfer happening also in strategic technology-driven areas, with these sustainable and continuous funding opportunities that should not be subject to ups and downs. I think it is better to have, from the discussions today, we heard that it is better to have a continuous sustained trend in science and innovation policy funding than a lot of up and downs. The policy mix, as I was saying, should be focused on supporting structural change. And finally, there were a few examples of balanced intellectual property right discussions. I remember Thomas referring to the quick settlement deal that they were making in Denmark, for the 90 days of agreement, to come up with a solution for IP processes. So I think that this is also an important element. If I can have the next slide. This is about the second panel on financing options, and I'm speaking here a little bit under the control of Katerina. But first of all, I think that one of the things that came clear out of the presentation at the panel was that there is a number of elements that matter, and in order to have the right financing tools, you need to take into account size, market, sector characteristics. And this is something which is very important, not only just having the adequate portfolios of funding tools available. We have seen a number of impressive funding tools from the European Investment Bank targeting different segments of the market, from basic research to disruptive innovation. So I think this kind of panoply of instruments should be put in place also to nurture, for instance, corporate venturing. But there has to be, again, this institutional flexibility for public research organizations and universities to be able to spin off companies, but also to be able to spin them in. And, of course, the EU tools, the EU funding tools are very important to support this, be it, let's say, the more research-oriented funding programs, but also the structural funds and other tools at the EU level. Another comment that was made by several people was the need to nurture the talent, so not just the human resources, and the researcher capacity in the system, which is extremely important, but also, to be able to dig into the education system in order to have the right entrepreneurial spirit out there. And finally, it is not all about funding, even if the discussion was on funding, because there is a number of aspects which go beyond funding, notably relating to expertise, to the need for having the right mechanisms for mentoring and advice out there. And if I can have the last slide. This is just a little bit of a teaser to say both Denmark and Portugal are on the move forward with respect to investment and reforms of their science and innovation system to boost science business cooperation. The diagnosis in both countries is different, and the base from which they depart in terms of economic structure and science and innovation system is, of course, also different. But both have an unexploited potential in terms of science business cooperation. In the case of Denmark, this is notably linked to barriers to research utilization and to IP rights issues. And they have a number of clear new policy responses out there from the public angle, including the Innovation Fund, these new binding targets to stimulate regional business science cooperation, cluster strategies, and other kinds of measures. In the case of Portugal, we have these Interfaz programs that the minister was talking about, also the collab laboratories that position themselves between the traditional university-driven kind of research and applied research and the business research in a space where there was a gap. So I think that this is also an important development. It is mostly driven towards attracting PhDs. However, it is still, a very important development in the system. And also there have been already measures that have been taking place a few years ago, such as the creation of the Agency for Innovation, or the kind of redefinition of the role of polytechnics and issues relating to the creation of the necessary conditions for creative hubs to take place. And the Beato Creative Hub is certainly one, which looks, I must say, rather promising. So this is a little bit of a summary of what I got from this morning's presentations. And again, sorry for taking a bit of time, but it was a very rich discussion, and it was complex to put all this together down in 2-3 slides. So thank you very much.
Early results and draft recommendation that emerge out of this review of higher education, research and innovation in Portugal. So this is a work that is still ongoing. We're working. Sorry? Oh, it's not working? Or so it's just too far from the mic, maybe? Okay. Oh, okay, no, that's the wrong. So you see, Dominic Rebgelek is working on that, but not at that.
I thought you could do the same.
No. Well, I can. No, it's on the.
It's on somewhere else.
It's directly on the.
Repetition helps, no? If you do
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So I was saying that this study is still ongoing. Actually, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I was still carrying out interviews, undertaking interviews, and specifically on that issue that we are most concerned of today, which is that of knowledge transfer in a broad sense. So first, let me tell you what is an OECD review, very briefly. Basically, it's a thorough assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of a research, innovation, and higher education system. And on the basis of this diagnostic, what we aim to do is, of course, to provide a recommendation to the government as to how to improve the system, how to benefit from those opportunities, how to mitigate some of the weaknesses. So this is what we do. This is done on demand, and this review was directly commissioned by the Ministry of Science, Technology and Higher Education in Portugal. But the scope of the review is not only the research, public research, it encompasses the whole system. So how we do that? First, we assemble a dedicated team of first policy analysts from OECD and some renowned experts. So we have experts with focus on specific areas that we believe from the start were issues that were a bit important in Portugal, like research careers, knowledge transfer, etc. Then we have done a comprehensive desk review, and especially this is the 5th mission in Portugal. We have met, I think it says 200, it's even more than that. We have done sessions, and even 2 weeks ago we were in Portugal, and we've been traveling all around Portugal, north, south, interior, coastal areas, to meet with all the different groups of stakeholders in this very diverse and vibrant ecosystem of research and innovation. And we have already presented some draft results and recommendations 2 weeks ago, and we have a constructive dialogue with the highest authority. You have seen this morning that the Minister of Research and Higher Education is very engaged. He has a vision, so you can imagine that it's very, very constructive to have a dialogue with him, and we have met with him for hours. You have also understood that when he starts talking, he can be really taken. So it's very interesting, but it's a constructive dialogue. But it's an independent review. So it's a dialogue, but in the end, the recommendations are OECD's. And so the start, we have all understood, and this is not something that is specific to Portugal, that Portugal has a goal. It wants to be a knowledge, it wants to make that journey being and becoming a knowledge-based society with improved economic performance, creation of high-skilled jobs, and something that is very important, increased social inclusion. You have heard the minister talking this morning several times about his concern with regard to the concentration of resources at European level on some of the countries and some of the zones in Europe. But within Portugal, there is also an issue of concentration of resource on the best research institutes and universities, or the best companies, which of course are not always located in the interior of the country, but mostly on the coastal zone. So this is a very, very key issue, and really our mandate and the mandate that Portugal has is really that this increase of the knowledge intensity of the country would benefit to the country at large, not to specific groups of people or not to specific geographic zone. And we all know that the system of innovation are very, very, very country specific. There is a huge importance of the different various institutional design, but still we know some things, and we know that to achieve that there need to be an ecosystem of actors, both in private and public, involved in the creation, diffusion and application of knowledge and ideas. They need to have clear mission, and we will come back on that. And they need to also to have a stable and predictable funding, policy framework and evaluation mechanisms in line with these missions. We will see that it has also a strong importance in Portugal, because we are maybe not totally there yet. There need to be a sustainable infrastructure to promote and support interactions between these actors, and there are many new initiatives in Portugal right now. This is really happening. There is a revival of these intermediary organizations. And last but not least, there need to be a governance structure that will balance the top-down and the bottom-up. And this is key. You will see. And there is a need to set broad system objectives. There is a need to provide a framework that will be stable, that will allow for the coordination of the different initiatives vertically, horizontally, to achieve these objectives, but still leaving autonomy for actors and what we would call a space for exploration. So really the top-down and the bottom-up is really at the core of our recommendations, and we try to balance this. So now, in terms of higher education, research and innovation, what is our diagnostic? I haven't added knowledge transfer here because that will be in the later part of this presentation. We can go very quick on that. I think we all agree that Portugal in the last 15 years has made tremendous economic and social progress. You look at all indicators in terms of living standards, in terms of health, life expectancy, etc. There has been tremendous progress. There has been a shift toward higher added value in some key sectors, traditional sectors, and also some emerging sectors. We heard about the molding industry, about the shoe industry, and there are the textile industry. We visited some of these technology centers, CITEV in textile, and this is really incredible how they have federated the whole ecosystem around them, providing new equipments, and they really have a strong, we believe, strong responsibility in the upgrading of this sector. And now all that has been, to some extent, frozen, of course, and hit very badly by the crisis, but now it's coming back, growth is returning, exports are rising, so things prospects are very good. But still, when we look at numbers and we compare internationally, we can only see that the productivity is still very low is still rather low by international standards. And if we look at something that is of most interest to us, which is the multi-factor productivity, which is this component within productivity that more or less account for something that is not directly attributable, cannot be attributed to capital or labor productivity, but represent also innovation, technology progress, better organization of activities. We see that Portugal, again, these are new data that are just coming out this week from OECD. We see that Italy, Portugal, and Spain are the three countries where multi-factor productivity in the past 10 years have been the lowest. There is still low business investment, especially in knowledge-intensive investment, and the debt is very high, and so that creates a very limited fiscal space, which means that these challenges have to be addressed with not a lot of new public money. So it will be a lot of reallocation and reshuffling, but there is not a huge amount of money that is here to be allocated for new activities. So it has to be, the public policy has to be very smart and agile here to address these problems. Human capital, there has been a very strong increase in tertiary education and attainment, and also there are new initiatives which are called TVET that really improve high-level professional education, and allowing also that create a bridge that allow some of secondary education students which are not yet sufficient to go in tertiary education, that create a new bridge for them to reach tertiary education. But again, by international standards, Portugal is still lagging behind, and we heard this morning that there is a strong demand for engineers and technicians, and so this is still something that has to be addressed. Overall investment in research, you can see that it has increased strongly until the crisis years. Then it's been decreasing, and now it's stable, and now it's going up again. Business investment during the rather high growth years before the crisis, Portugal was one of the countries with the highest, most rapid growth of business investment in R&D. So, but again, international standards, when you look at the bright side of, if you look at Portugal, the evolution, you look at the bright side of life. If you put it in a more international or European context, of course, Portugal is still, in terms of level that is reached, although the trends are good, it's still lagging behind. This has created something already. If we look only at research outputs, mainly scientific publications, we see that Portugal is doing good. There has been a strong rise of scientific outputs, both in terms of quantity, the volume of publication, but also quality. when you look at the citations and the share that the publications of Portugal represent in the total volume of the top 1% or 10% most cited publication, Portugal is doing pretty good. It's close from the average. It's just below the average in terms of citations and presence in the top publications. When we look now a bit more downstream toward innovation results, and of course we don't have we all know that here in terms of indicators of innovation is still very complicated and constrained, and we are obliged to rely upon patent statistics. It's not ideal, but it still tells something about the innovation capacity or some innovation capacity of countries. And we see here it's the black losange. I'm not sure how to say that in English, but this represents Portugal, and you see that in terms of patents, still Portugal is not even in before the first quartile. And something also important is to see that where do they come from, these patents. We expect them to come, and we hope that they would come from companies, but they're not. If you look at who is producing, developing, applying, and applying for these patents, you see that it's very much universities. And when you look at companies, it's below the OECD average. Now, coming to the knowledge transfer and having a closer look on the knowledge transfer component of the system, which is what is of most interest to us today. Looking at the overall system and how that can be improved. So the governance of the system, basically, today our diagnostic is that the governance system in Portugal is still very complex, and especially it's fragmented with limited interministerial coordination. So that means that basically the core of the innovation system, governance innovation system, which include the Ministry of Research and Higher Education on one side and the Ministry of Economy, Innovation on the other side, are still too much working in silo, and there is not enough interaction, although there are some bridges like the Innovation Agency that have a double supervision, but even there we don't believe that this is sufficient to allow for interministerial coordination. And we know that with these new technologies and that they need, like digital technologies, they need a comprehensive and holistic approach, and here this is not clear. This is not happening. There is something that is, in this context, something that would be very much welcome would be a research, an overarching and shared national strategy that would cover research, innovation, and higher education. And this is not that. There are different documents, strategic documents, but there is not one higher education, research and innovation strategy that would help also this coordination and that would provide a vision for actors. And when we talked with actors, sometimes at OECD, like in other organizations, when you make this type of recommendation that there would be a need for an overall vision, but is it really important, or are we just adding another layer of governance and bureaucracy on that? And does it really mean something for actors, for companies? But when we talked with many companies and intermediary organizations, without even asking, we say, what could be improved? They all say, we need a vision, we need a stable framework, strategic framework where we know that we can rely upon. And when we talk with other countries, we've done other reviews, of course, in other countries. We've just completed the review of Norway, who have such strategy. And you talk with all the actors, it always comes back. The strategy always comes back. It's a point of reference, and this is something that is missing in Portugal. There is a governance structure, interministerial, even inter-level, with governance that is inter-level, the linking regional and national levels of governance. That exists in Portugal, but that is directly related to the administration, the management of the structural funds. So there is a strategy, it's a national smart specialization strategy, as we all know, and there are also governance structure to manage those, the implementation of this strategy. But still, so it's there, it's instrumental to some extent, but it's too focused, of course, on the operational aspect rather than the strategic aspects, and also it's narrow because it's related only to the management of the structural funds, and there is a wide component that and other programs, other funds other activities that are not governed by or addressed by this, covered by this strategy. So too operational and too narrow. Also something we talked about, horizontal interministerial coordination, something very important, if we go down one level, is the vertical coordination between the ministry and the agencies. And here what we see, especially in the case of the research agency, FCT, and its relation with the Ministry of Science and Technology, we believe that there is very much a lack of autonomy. That creates many problems, including a lack of stability of the intervention, because of course when the agency is too close from the ministry, when the principal agent type of relationship is problematic and it's too close like this, then the agency is too much focused on the shorter term or medium term, shorter term horizon, and not having a long-term strategy and horizon for operating. That creates also a problem of predictability, because the actions that are going to be put in place by this agency are going to change every time the government changes, and this is what we see. And this is compounded by the fact that many of the programs and intervention that are provided and support that are provided by these agencies, it's true for the FCT, but it's true also for the Innovation Agency, are financed through structural funds. And again, the generation of structural funds, each generation of structural funds, you're going to have a renewal of the policy instruments or a renewal of the strategic framework and all that. So that really, the lack of stability of the policy framework is really something that we've done already maybe 50, 60 meetings and panels all throughout Portugal, and this is something that is coming back all the time. The problem is that the policy framework is changing, the way they evaluate R&D units is changing, etc. The policy instruments are changing. So one of the recommendations we have is, it's obvious given what I said and the diagnostic is to create an interministerial body, or at least an horizontal body, to develop governance body, high level, at the highest level, to develop and coordinate a national higher education research and innovation strategy, and that would advise also the government on all comprehensive reforms. It has, very important, it has to have a wide scope covering not only research, but higher education, research and innovation, under the purview of all the ministries on this wide scope. It has to be developed and revised with extensive consultation and engagement of the stakeholders. Again, I come back to this balance between the top-down and the bottom-up. We are not proposing a Soviet plan. OECD has not moved, it's often said now that OECD has moved from a deregulation think tank to a regulation think tank, but we are not there at the Soviet plan. We are not there yet. It has to be supported, very important. It has to be, because there are so many failures. You all know, I'm sure, examples of failure of this interministerial high-level expert body that are active for 2 years and then it vanish. So there are some things we know that might help them to operate better and to survive the different governments. One is to have sufficient analytical and administrative resources. It means some dedicated staff or some ways of drawing upon the analytical capacity of some of the agency in the form of foresight, evaluation capacity, strategic intelligence capabilities, so that they can do better planning and evaluation. Chair or not by the Prime Minister, who should be sitting around the table, that is still to be we need to think about this a bit better, but definitely it shouldn't be only, of course, public servants. It has to be, the companies have to be here, the civil society has to be represented, it needs legitimacy and it needs analytical capacity, I'm sorry. Reform FCT to give it a clear medium-term mandate and autonomy to implement it. The autonomy of, we believe this is really something that we see in many countries. There is a need for the minister, the ministry need to provide the agency with very clear objectives, but then, and that must be a multi-year framework, but then the agency need to have the autonomy to find its own way to achieve the objectives. And that can be done in some countries. This is done through some kind of performance agreements. There are different ways to do that. When we go down one level and look at the institutions, mainly the higher education institutions, our diagnostics is that the higher education institutions are insufficiently differentiated. You know that there is a dual landscape, as we say, in Portugal, with the the universities and the polytechnics, which are the what we would call a university of applied sciences in other countries, for instance. And this is very important. We believe this is very relevant for the situation in Portugal. But what we see now is that more and more the frontiers between those two categories, those two type of organization are becoming blurred. With, you see, I'm destroying the European Commission as well. So what we see is that the universities are now more and more, as we all know, going downstream and we ask that to this organization. They are asked to do that. They have to do more and more cooperation with industry, and on the other side, the polytechnics are more and more looking toward the university. They want to have PhDs. They want to be able to grant PhDs, etc. So the frontiers are being blurred, and this is not unusual. But what is problematic is when there is not a framework, a stable framework, again, with clear profiles of this organization, so that they would try to keep in line with their missions. So here we see some potential threat. The institutional autonomy of higher education institution is not fully exploited. There has been a move. There has been, following the 2007 review, OECD review of higher education in Portugal, there has been a new status for some of the university has been created. These are the private foundations, but for different reasons, I won't enter into the detail. This additional level of autonomy that has been granted to these institutions have not been fully exploited. They don't still high under the regime of the private under private status, etc. There are many things that they are not venturing into yet. The research units are, there is a specific situation in Portugal where many of the research units within the universities are in fact, well, basically they are related to the universities, but some of them are outside the universities. They are independent from the university. This is again some heritage from from 15 or 20 years ago, when they have created these R&D units. There was a clear decision not to create them within the university, but as an additional layer around the universities, in order to bypass some of the rigidities that existed within universities, and for other reasons as well. But that now we still have this situation in Portugal, and the problem is that the strategic management of university doesn't have a grip on those research institutes, so it cannot really have an integrated strategy at the institutional level, a research strategy, because they do not control these R&D units. Very important for what is of interest to us today, the mechanism for allocating resources to these individual, to these universities and polytechnics. Basically the institutional funding, the block funding, is done on the basis, on a historical trend of allocation. It's not based on performance. It's not, and it's very much related to the number of students and not to performance criteria. So the potential recommendation, the draft recommendation that we have, the leads for recommendation, are first to ensure legal and policy clarity on the different missions of universities and polytechnics. Introduce, very important, introduce small, limited scope, multi-annual performance agreements to manage the relationship between the ministry and these institutions. So that would be based, or that again, that would be based on strategies that would be developed by each of the universities. They would engage, they would commit to some objectives, and they would receive financing, and they would be evaluated based on this. When we say small, we insist upon the small. The idea is not to create a shock in Portugal. It has to start with something like 15–20% of resources would be allocated like this, because of course doing that, increasing too much the level of performance-based funding would create a huge reshuffling of allocation of resources within university. We do not want that. Nobody wants that. It has to be, it has to remain to some extent. It has to be progressive and cumulative. And there are some international good practices as to how these performance agreements can be negotiated, what should be included, what should not, and so there is a wealth of experience, and Portugal can very much rely upon this. There should be also targeted program to develop management and professional staff in these institutions if there are performance agreements, if there is increasing autonomy, if the money is allocating according to performance criteria, then there is a need also to increase the level of capabilities at strategic management level in universities, and this has improved a lot, and especially with new generations of rectors and vice president and all this, but there are still a need for training and in that regard, and there is a need for flexibility in financial management, procurement and staffing. That is seems to be obvious, but in Portugal this is really very much hindering the dynamic within the universities. When you cannot hire, when every procurement becomes a nightmare, this is just not doable, and that really create all the willingness to engage into a bit more alternative ways of working. So I'm sorry, that was not about knowledge transfer. This is about knowledge transfer. Innovation dynamics. We said that this morning several times. We heard that several times. There is, somebody was saying Portugal has the industry, it has the company, it has. Indeed, this is really a strong structural, there are strong structural features of the industry in Portugal. The past traditional industries are still geared toward domestic markets. When they are exporting, where they are still, many of them are still exporting based on the low cost approach. There are some notable success stories, and every time we say that, people will raise their hand but say, but yeah, but what about Bosch in Braga, or etc. There are a few of them. We heard that there are 5 multinationals, and there are also some very good examples of new startups and some emerging industries also. But these are still, that does not represent that doesn't tell the whole story. The low, medium tech SMEs are still in fact, account for the bulk of companies in Portugal. And so we very much believe that there is a great potential, untapped potential, or not enough, sufficiently tapped into potential to raise the level of productivity of Portugal and innovation in Portugal by supporting those SMEs in traditional sectors. And that's very much related to the debate that we had in the first panel between, what do we do with the PhDs, or maybe we should just try first by upgrading the innovation capacity in traditional sectors and provide the right technicians and engineers. The crisis and the following financial austerity has hit public and private R&D investment. There has been a slowdown of investment in industry. Some formerly strong sectors, telecommunication, energy, that really represented, accounting for a strong share of R&D expenditures in Portugal, have declined, and new emerging sectors have not yet taken over, although, again, there are some sparks and very international best practice in Portugal, but these are still very limited. And FDI, especially knowledge-intensive FDI, remain limited. I mentioned already that when we the issue of the geographical location within Portugal of those high intense and knowledge intensity activities is very important. There is a strong regional imbalances of innovation activities, with the concentration of these activities on the coastal zone. We can see that there are very significant efforts of higher education institutions, especially polytechnics in the interior of the country, that engage, and we visited them, they engage with company, they are very dynamic, they really strive to engage and with not only companies but also public services around. But this is still insufficient, of course, They cannot by themselves counterbalance this these dynamics of concentration of resources in some areas on the coastal area. They also have to fight against the demographic decline and the outward migration from the students, etc., that go directly from the interior of the country, and they want to have a position in the universities on the coastal area. There has been considerable investment and increasing investment of structural funds and increasingly focus on the innovation side rather than the research side in those less developed regions based on the smart specialization strategy. But as I said, it's mainly project-based, so it doesn't really provide an encompassing framework, a program approach. It's rather bottom-up. It's not integrated program. If you look at the details, if you look in the cores, if you look in the criteria of scientific excellence is still very prominent, rather than the strategic relevance criteria that we could expect at that level in that area of innovation. And also something that is very interesting is the fact that the national funds that are used mainly to compensate the other regions. So here the whole objective of catching up, of support to catching up of structural funds is to some extent diminished by the fact that then the national authority, the state budget will be used mainly in Lisbon, Porto to try to compensate for the fact that they don't have as much structural funds. So these are broad recommendations. We are still working on these. We think that there is a need to strengthen regionally based cluster or sectoral initiatives, inter-sectoral initiative in order to promote their upgrading and competitiveness. Portugal is still a rather small country, of course, and there is a need to make priorities. There has been a very strong and long tradition in Portugal of bottom-up approach, no targeting, limited steering. We believe that there is a need to bet on some promising sectors and add some relevance to the system. Keep on supporting the upgrading of polytechnics toward practice-based knowledge-intensive institutions dedicated to local development that is related to the role that we believe they have played so far and they are still playing in the development of the interior, especially regions. Highly qualified personnel, industry and service, we discussed that. There has been a significant improvement of the level of qualification of the population, resulting in a high level, high quality human resource base of graduates and also increasingly PhD holders. A strong increase, we can see a strong increase of the demand for technicians and engineers, and that has created now a shortage of skilled staff relevant to development needs of firms in certain sectors. We met with some Bosch, we met with Farfetch, we met with several companies, and they provided us their plan in terms of recruitment, prospect for recruitment of engineers and technicians, not PhDs. It's thrilling. I mean, we're talking about thousands of engineers in each of them in the next 2 or 3 years, and they just tell us we don't know where we're going to get them, and this is compounded by the fact that there is the demographic prospects are pretty bad for the next 10 years, 15, even more. With a decline of the number of students in tertiary education. So the shortage is going to be even worse in the years to come. When we look at TVET vocational training, which is very important, there is apparently a mismatch between the needs in the different regions and the type of training that is providing in this region. There was an evaluation we haven't crunched the number ourselves, but there is an evaluation, and that was their diagnostics, their results. And there is a lack, anyway, of data to pilot and monitor public support schemes, because again, there is a mismatch between we believe that there is a mismatch between the supply and the demand of skills at regional level, sectoral level, but we don't have the data. There is really a need to have better data on that in Portugal and try to be able to monitor this a bit more with scrutiny. Still on the high qualified personnel, there has been a significant increase in the number of PhDs, But as I said, just like I said before, there is no steering, there is no targeting. So basically the allocation between the different disciplinary fields is done on historical patterns rather than prospective views of what the economy is going to need. And there is no link to the national priorities, if any, at that level. There is a focus on individual research and limited attention to transversal skills and employability in those PhD trainings, and we know the extent to which this is key for if we want to use PhDs not only in the public sector, but we want them to be hired in the industry and civil society outside the academic sector. There are few, we said that this morning, few doctorate holders that work outside, that find a position outside the academia and public research. The good news is that if we look at the different generations of PhD, we see that the one that have been graduated very recently are much more inclined and found positions in industry much more than those that got their PhDs 10 or 20 years ago. So recent graduates 15% outside academia, and recent graduates only it's the country. Recent graduate 15% and formerly 4%. So there is a need to align the allocation of PhD more closely to national needs by allocating, for instance, a proportion of PhD grants to specific fields in line with strategic priority fields and forecast. There is a need to use relevant instruments to increase the focus on transversal skills in PhD training, and there are ways to do that. And there is a need to develop an approach to increase employment of PhD graduates in the wider economy. We heard about different schemes, PhD in companies. This is something that has been on and off in Portugal, and it's not clear whether there is really a framework for this and clear incentives for companies to hire PhDs. Knowledge transfer. We heard the diagnosis before. This is only a minority of innovative firms engaged in cooperation. The Portugal science base is still insufficiently connected to innovation. If we look at, for instance, in the patents, what is the origin of the publications that are cited in patents, we see that the Portuguese researchers does not appear very, very often. But the situation is really improving, and here this is the rosy part. When we look at the number of Portuguese participation and collaboration in horizontal 2020 projects and programs, when we look at the number of national collaborative projects, this is really rising. There are even, it's not only more collaboration, but also when we look at the portfolio of companies that are beneficiaries in these schemes, we see that there are a lot of newcomers. So the innovation base is expanding. This is very good news. The number of spin-off also, but unfortunately, as we said this morning, there are not many data on that. We don't have integrated data. We don't know exactly. We don't have national data on spin-off. And what we know is that it's now decreasing because of the recovery. Now there is less creation of a spin-off. Science industry, so collaboration remains marginal. There is a lack of effective incentives in higher education and research to cooperate with private sectors, both at institutional and individual researchers level. Basically, there is almost no incentive for researchers to, no reward for them to go outside and work with companies. There is a well-diversified infrastructure of intermediary organization, the TTOs, the pole cluster, etc., the technology centers, but they are underfunding, and especially they have no basic funding, and they have been obliged to go more toward market services, engineering, consulting, especially during the crisis years. And there is a very wide portfolio of project-based policy instruments to support innovation, and there are many promising new initiatives now to increase the volume and quality of science industry. We talked about collabs. The interface program also is something that will provide this basic funding. So several of the weaknesses that we have identified here, in fact, are being addressed right now by new programs, but they are still, for the moment, still promises, let's say it that way. So there is a need to promote flexible career path in public research and provide incentive for good innovation performance, ensure that intermediary organizations have a sufficient level of pluriannual funding, basic funding, and there is a need to strengthen knowledge transfer and incubation functions, provide them also with basic funding. They need a training of dedicated staff. We see that there is still enough not professional staff in those TTOs. And very important, we heard this morning that there is a need for critical mass, and I think it was a person from the IBE was saying that this study from 2013 showed that the bigger the university, the better for the performance of the incubators. I think that's what. And so there is a need to mutualize, and there are new models that are emerging in Europe in that regard. This is the most difficult part of my presentation, but I leave it to you. Thank you very much.
Your view, do you agree with OECD's vision or view on this? And because to me at least, it was the circumstances when you compare Denmark, which I'm working with, and Portugal, of course, you have completely different circumstances. I would like to present the speakers. I'll start from the very right. Manuel Carondo. He is a vice president and founder of the IBET, which is the Institute for Experimental and Technological Biology. He's also a professor. In fact, he was just lecturing today, I learned. He's a professor in chemical and biochemical engineering at the new University of Lisbon. And I also learned he has also been working in Denmark. The second speaker is Matthias, on my right side. He's my compatriot from Sweden. He was working in Denmark until recently. Now, currently, he's working in the European Commission at the Joint Research Center. He's a program manager for intellectual property rights and technological transfer in the Joint Research Center. And you've been studying, well, at quite many places, I think. You speak Spanish, you're studying US and UK and whatever the place. Yeah. The third speaker, Teresa, is a president of the Instituto Pedro Núñez, IPN, which you will present. You have a degree in engineering and electronics from University of Coimbra, if I can pronounce that correctly, 1975. And she was a professor at the Department of Informatics at the Faculty of Science and Technology in Coimbra. And lastly, we have from the more political side, Ricardo Pinheiro Alves, director at the research office in Portuguese Ministry at the Economy, and he's also assistant professor at ERDE. Well, you have to explain that to me afterwards. He also representing Portugal at different committees in OECD and the Council of the European Union. You have a PhD in economics from Bath in UK. And but can we then have the first speaker, Mr. Carondo?
Directly their art of policy, and as you said, it makes a short-term issue that we have, and probably the major difference to Denmark and how it started was mainly in Denmark anyway. We've been pirates, buccaneers, but also depending on the state, 5 centuries, and that's what we are. We are used to have the state support everything we do. If there's no support from the state, we don't do it. Okay. So, IBET was started at the same time as ITQB in the mid-80s when I was a professor at MIT, and it was clear, am I not on? Am I full? Or... Okay, I'll use my powerful voice. Yeah, good. So, it was started in the mid-80s when it was obvious that the fusion of biology and engineering would potentially make biotechnology appear. And so my colleague Antonio Xavier started the more basic component at ITQB, while I started the transfer component at IBET. And essentially what we've been doing ever since is trying to fuse the competences and the resources of the university with what we want to do as an interface. First, you have to realize what I'm going to say has no bearing to what could be done today. This started early on. 30 years is a long time. Furthermore, biotech is hardcore. If you are an IT, as I tell my friends, and I've imported some of those, if you're an IT, if you don't have an headache, you can work 24 hours a day. If you're in biotech, you need resources almost like high particle physics, only the biologists have not been as good as the high particle physicists to bring in the money from the politicians. So completely different. And of course what it also means is that it is experimentally complex. And that again, if you're not very close to university, in a poor country as we are, no company, no startup will survive on its own. And that's the situation we've had in the past. The majority of the startups have failed because there's not enough support. So you really need to be close to university, and of course this is what we've been doing. The fact that we are a poor country is not necessarily bad, because what it means is that you have to be frugal. By being frugal, you have to be more inventive, and in some cases you have to create situations, and I was just briefly talking with Pedro Nunes, president here, where you need to put together an infrastructure that guarantees that some of the knowledge stays and is used for the transfer. In my days at MIT, I was stupid enough once to have the lady who was presiding the patent portfolio, which was of course even then in the 80s, so already something. How proactive was she in just putting out the patent portfolio? And she looked at me almost as if I was insulting her. Manual, proactive. We are MIT. People come to us. And it was obvious for me that people would not come to IBET for many years to come. We're getting to that point now, but obviously we're not yet MIT. So that's life. So if you do properly, eventually you create something that works. We are a European research organization located in Portugal. Essentially what we do is we're putting together the competences that exist, trying to work with pharma, big pharma, international pharma, because there's no way international pharma will come and work here at all. Our laws change every second, the taxes are what we know. We have all the usual situations which make foreign direct investment not going to happen. But if you link and put together and organize competent people, then they have no problem to work with us. We take the risk. And in a way, that's mostly what we've been doing. So you could say that I'm doing the same thing people were doing in the 60s in textiles. I was getting the orders from outside, putting people together, and just trying to do the best I can. Obviously, in our case, since we are science-driven, there is no way we can deliver services only. And this is clear with all the companies we work. Either we are contributing to the science, because then this might ensure sustainability, or if they just want us to do high throughput systems, forget it, we're not the ones for that, go out. And that's been working reasonably well so far, so I can't complain. But of course, we have to draw from the competencies of the partners we have, in particular Faculty of Science and Technology and our medical school, some of the academic hospitals, slowly going from the preclinical discovery research and translational capacities. In a way, what you're trying to do here is things that you've been doing for at least 6 decades up north. How do you start them up now? Now that we have a rather substantial number of partner companies from the outside, how do you make these companies come and work also with the clinicians in our partner hospitals? Those things have been done in Denmark or Holland or whatever 60 years ago. So trying to create it. If I ask Denmark how they started, nobody remembers. So we have to do it somehow. It's going to be slow, it's going to be diffusive, so you cannot expect huge solutions tomorrow. Of course, we give a lot of things back to the university, we think. This is not always obvious. Very commonly, some of the academics tend to think we robbed the university. You have to live with that. No problem. You survive. We do a lot of postgraduate training because the students do PhD works with us and international companies we work with. Last week, for example, one of the academic partners working with us got a Nature Communications paper out with Merck Darmstadt, and that's the kind of thing we have regularly happening. But we also hire ex-students, evidently. We need good people, so why not? We share equipment, and nowadays as we're getting richer and the university is getting poorer, we even buy the equipment for the university. Otherwise, not much is happening. Universities have been devoid of finance for a long time, as we've seen, and there's no autonomy, there's no way they can work easily and be autonomous again.
I think we give an enlarged footprint for the whole of activities. We organize the resources. That's the key point. Academics tend to work on small silos. And obviously, the first things we did in the early 90s, for example, a couple of patents with sharing in those days, now part of Bayer, where we would do the structure of a protein involved in a prostate cancer. If I only did a structure of a protein now, nobody would come here. So we have to do a much broader type of things, and that's why having been in a poor country, having had to establish the infrastructure, now I have the infrastructure to make the whole more appealing to the companies we work with. Finally, of course, we think that we increase the visibility of the university. So ITQB, which is our first and major partner, is essentially molecular biosciences, protein biochemistry, what have you, and we use them as much as we can. And of course, we collaborate with them in the various types of postgraduate programs which they have. So we pick, and that's the point for us, we have to be a lot more choosy than most people. If we don't have outstanding people, we're not going to survive working with top-notch companies. And so our approach is American clear. A people hire A people, B people hire C people. We cannot afford to hire B people, which means we cannot grow as fast as we would like, because there are lots of E people in a country used to do, you know, reasonably easy life close to the government situations. So we play a lot of these PhDs, but of course these are defended in the university, and of course whatever publication comes out has both IBETS and the university affiliation, so the university gets, you know, in terms of times, indexes, whatever, we get it together. That's where we are. So we built the building such that it will be shared by both of us. This is Awareness. And then we have a pilot plant there, where on top of which we've recently put, some 7 years ago, a GMP unit, which is a spin-off from us. So some of the companies we work with in between even went one step further, which is what we like to say, we are part of their network of research. So in these three areas, our scientists contribute to the company's science. And they are, normally these companies work, for example, Novartis was the first one to go to Boston to do most of the research there. Novartis Institute of Biomedical Research. So we work with Boston, and we work also with Basel in the second stage when the company goes from phase 2 to phase 3. And the triangulation is Lisbon, Novartis, Basel, Novartis, Boston. So every third year we get the people. Always small units, evidently, but still they part of the team company, and they share the basic competencies which we have created. And this allows us, for example, last year alone, we bought a $750,000 mass spec. It's the 7th we have, because that's a very important tool for us. I couldn't afford that if I wouldn't be sure that I would be somehow cutting this cost or distributing this cost through lots of projects with different companies and then putting forward. So at the moment we already hire not 54 any longer. Since last week we hire 60 PhDs plus about 90 researchers, and then I'm used as a professor, so I'm not paid through EBET, so we use, like me, about 30 professors from the different teams we have together. We don't pay them anything else. We give them a huge advantage in terms of facilitating contacts with industries, facilitating to buy one thing from today to tomorrow, as opposed to going through all these completely crazy ways of buying in public system, which applies to research and relays research to a huge extent people don't really realize. And of course we have to be GMP, we have to be whatever for all the other things. Our companies are the best you have in the life sciences in Portugal. Unfortunately, their scale is not the same as the ones we work outside. So when we were created in '89, the idea was we would be working with Portuguese companies, and in '91 we told our partners, if we only work with you, we're going to go nowhere. The science that's been done in the universities is a lot more valid than what you'd be able to use, so are we allowed to go outside? It was unanimous. Our partners still very much support the idea that we break our teeth and we make our wars with outside companies. The competence is really made with them, and then we internalize as much as we can, distribute to the companies we work with. So, but for example, Novartis alone sells some 55 billion Swiss francs a year. Our largest pharmaceutical company, which is Bial, sells something like 200 million. You cannot expect they have the same sort of situation. We have a project with them, interesting one. They are on brain, on Alzheimer, on a patent from us, but they are delaying some of their patents because they don't have enough money to do all the research they need. This is what we have. Similarly, the largest, Nutriinvest, which is olive oil essentially, oils of all sorts, diesel, whatever, 1.5 billion. We work with Nestle, which is 95 billion. So this is the kind of scale you have. And if you don't match both, you're going nowhere. The major advantage on top of money which we get from our Portuguese partners is that since the very first day, we've used them to do the financial issues, the administrative issues, the human resources aspects. We don't know as academics how to set a bonus policy, how to set a situation where the objectives are clearly stated. Those kinds of things which academics don't really know how to do have been done by our industrial partners from the beginning. And I believe this is a substantial amount of the reason why we've been quite successful. Okay, so of course the foundations, of course the universities, so Classical University, Nova, and Catholic University in Porto, because they have a component which is on biotech, especially agro-food. So, of course, in international terms, the money is there, pharma. For example, again, Novartis, 55 billion sales, 9.5 billion R&D, Nestle, 95 billion sales, 1.8 billion. You have that sort of relationship. 1% in agro, 15% in pharma. So we, again, do a lot more work out of pharma. We do have some particular links to Latin America, a few in Africa, especially developing veterinary vaccines. We were part of the Rinderpest vaccine eradication, pest epidemic, things of that sort. But essentially, of course, since we rely on money and rely on contracts, it's the rich northern part of the world we work with. As I said, health and pharma is the key one. Food and health is somehow supported or financed by the money we make on the health and pharma side. And of course, it's food and health. Agro-industry is a lot more technology driven, so there's no way we would have all sorts of technologies. So when we work with the food and technology companies in Portugal, whatever pilot plant is needed stays in the factory, and we do the component part, because that's what makes sense, and that's why some of them keep working with us in those areas. Just very briefly, we do a lot of biopharmaceuticals, advanced therapy medicinal products. Structural biology is the key two components. In food and health is nutraceuticals and bioactives. This is the basic science, or basic science a bit too much maybe, but the component of science which we contribute, which is new, innovative, of course also relevant, and then we transfer to the companies, and then the infrastructure is of course the pilot plant, the analytical services units, and the Genibet spin-off, which has been producing for the outside world, especially Boston, Germany, and Switzerland since 2007. So at the end of the day, we've closed this particular circle, and this means that the way in which we operate, this is the Genibet pilot plant, the way in which we operate is again a poor country's way. Everything which is development is done by IBET. Everything with production is done by Genibet, because they are the ones that know GMP. They are the ones that as a company have to do the commercial aspects of things. And everything which is analyticals for the dossier, so that the products can be used in clinical trials in the States or in Europe, whatever, is again done in our GMP unit. So each one of these units has got to be more or less self-sustainable, and that's the only way we can go forward and keep a substantial amount of companies that come forward over and over. And as I started saying, nobody would come to us. Last week alone we had 14 visiting people from different companies. This week already we've added 3 extra PhDs, out of which 2 yesterday from Bayer. So this is starting to happen, and we cannot grow faster because the researchers are the ones we pick scientifically top. But in this area, science is not enough. And it was obvious in the review which was there, the management of the projects, the capacity to work with different cultures. It's not that the German culture is too different from ours. They can be as rude as I can. That's not the issue. The issue is we are small, so we can decide tomorrow. A decision can be taken from today to tomorrow. If I want a decision from one of those companies, possibly takes 3 months, and the contract takes another 6 months. So we have created ways to operate with them such that we can make or start much faster, and then they pay me in 6 months' time, but we go as early as we can. So this is the the portfolio we have, and of course on the food side, we have a lot less partnerships with international companies, as you would expect. It's and a lot more partnerships with Portuguese, reasonably small by size of sales companies. So that's how we survive. More recently, over the last 3 years, we're pushing some of this towards the academic hospitals of Nova and the Oncology Institute in Lisboa. And again, the major advantage these institutes have, and the word is not mine, it was one of the partners we put through one of these, they are naive hospitals. They have, in some cases, outstandingly good clinical teams. In the last 8 years, the medical doctors, some of them, were finally allowed to get their graduation, not through traditional internship, but through PhDs. And this was a lot of a fight from the medical doctors for almost 20 years. And now some of these are outstanding again, because medical doctors have to have 18 point something on 20 just to get in. So the ones that are good are outstanding, but they're not completely not used to that. So how do we percolate this kind of approach to them? And more than that, how do you make that happen? We pay a few people inside hospitals just to ensure that the reinforcement of the work for research can be done, medical doctors being quite obviously very occupied. So this is, to cut a long story short, I think in a nutshell, I'm not pretending this can be copied easily, but if we were not close to university, we wouldn't exist at this stage. If the university was not close to us, they would be a lot poorer than they are. Thanks.
Anybody has any instant questions to Mr. Carondo? Otherwise, I will introduce Matthias Dinetz to make your.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so this is a bold title. So my name is Matthias Dinetz, and I come from the JRC at the European Commission. Let's see. Can I have the first? There it is. Let's see how this technology works. Good. Yes, so this is a short overview of what I'm going to talk about these 10 minutes. So basically JRC and what we do in this sphere of technology transfer and intellectual property. I tried to stick to the panel theme, which was how we can improve technology transfer or knowledge transfer at university level. So I'm going to talk about physical and intellectual support frameworks, importance of intellectual property, and I hope this slide is not going to make you sleep, because it's normally viewed as a boring topic, but I'll try to spice it up. Incentives, we've been mentioning incentives throughout the day, and I think it's important that we focus more on it on the micro level, because it's easy to talk about, but you also have to know how to design incentives and who they should incentivize in the system, which means you have to know the system from the bottom up. Indicators and proxies, these might coincide with, for example, OECD's indicators, but they are practically my own that I've used when I work with researchers to spin out companies and make licenses. So it's basically my personal view on indicators and proxies. And then the short summary. Okay, it's pretty dense, but we'll get through. So JRC is the European Commission's in-house science service. So we don't make policy ourselves, but we give input to the policy-making DGs. And it's science-based, so we have 2,500 researchers in most branches of science who do research to make input to policy. So biologists, mechanical engineers, things like this. So our unit is the IP and TT unit, and the T is missing, I can see. We focus on some policy themes. They change over time, but we try to keep focus. So we're looking at the changing role of IP in society. So for example, IP finance, how to raise new models of raising finance using IP, because IP is getting more and more important in the knowledge, by the development of the knowledge economy that we are facing. So we give input to development of new financial instruments, which is targeting the tech transfer or even earlier the proof of concept, so earlier than pre-seed, proof of concept in certain geographical areas and targeting certain sectors. So so right now we're focusing on developing a tool for the Western Balkans to whip up consciousness about tech transfer and technology and how you can commercialize it. So basically prepare the ground for more downstream instruments from EIB Group. And we do capacity building, basically teaching people how to deal with researchers who have ideas that need to be protected and commercialized. So we do this on regional basis and national basis, together with member states as well. So 2 examples: macro-regional innovation, the Danube innovation strategy. These are policy or politics-driven processes. So, for example, we would like to have Western Balkans in the European Union at some stage. So this is a tool to help this, and easier than talking about politics, you can talk about technology. So it's more or less like a tech diplomacy in some way. We are the secretariat for something called the TTO Circle, which is tying together the PROs, the TTOs of PROs all over Europe, the best ones. So CERN, Max Planck, Fraunhofer, CA, you name it, all the best from Europe, to use as a sounding board and to get information on, for example, incentives. How do you incentivize your researchers? What is best? How do you do? Do you blend non-monetary with monetary incentives? How do you think? So, so this is, and an important part is the research infrastructure for innovation, which has been, it's trending right now. You want to share, you want to open up your research infrastructures for SMEs especially, or researchers to engage and to test beds, test their research, or be able to enable research that they cannot do in their home institution. So this is one idea, and we're working on that. There's a workshop next week in Gothenburg, actually, where we deal with this. So, and interestingly and quite anti-intuitive, we are a PRO, actually. So we have patent families that we manage. We manage IP of the European Commission. So the researchers which we have employed, they sometimes produce intellectual property. We also we own, for example, the emblem we manage. So if somebody tries to use it for their own benefit, we send a boo letter. And also, so patents, copyright in the EU buildings and things like this. So we are a TTO inside the European Commission, which nobody knows, basically. So we try to use this operative experience to do policy making, or to give input to policy making. So IP management, commercialization operations. I sometimes do license deals, or file a new trademark. For example, the star leaf for the ecological products is filed by us. And I manage the proof of concept fund that we have, which is also internal. It's not huge, but it's successful. So it's 400,000 euro per year, which finances about 6-7 projects. So and we have a hit rate or a success rate of 65% of the projects since 2001. So this we use also to advise on how to set up proof of concept projects. Hence the Western Balkans initiative. We can actually say that we did it. It's not just a policy advice, it's something that we do and can teach them how to do. Okay, so necessary infrastructure, high quality research, or excellent research, depends on where you are. For more lagging regions also the good research is important, not just the top notch. Political awareness is very important. You have to have senior management, even of the country, I would say. You have to have the policy level or the politics level engaged in this and being interested and seeing what it can do. Maybe by looking at other countries. Israel was mentioned this morning. That's a good example. It can be done. So there's accessibility research infrastructures I've mentioned. There has to be public funding, of course, for this. So a recent GRC report actually looks at these issues and sees a strong link between scientific excellence and also economic impact or economic growth. So, and you see successful high-tech companies are around star research universities. It makes sense, but this report shows it by statistics and interviews. So, yeah, the 10% out of the top-notch 10% is important because you can still have economic value out of research that is not top-notch. Everything cannot be top-notch, even if it's nicer to work with. Things that have to work in the university setting or PRO setting is cash, first of all, but effective systems to identify, protect, develop, and transfer intellectual property. You have to do this, and for that it takes money. So even at my old employer, which was DTU, there the principal said we need more patents. We're not producing enough patents or assets. So the patent budget was increased by I don't know how many percent. Then you get a lot of patents. You train people how to deal with this. Okay, everything wasn't good then, but you fine-tune your processes, and you also select the good patents. The other ones you close down. So you have to have sufficient internal budget. You also have to have interested people, and not just scientists, but also the business developers. They need to feel that they're champions for the technology. So there comes the question again, how to incentivize them. Do you want to give them a bonus, or do you want to give them equity in the startup that comes, or part of the license revenue? With the researcher it's more easy, because then you can give a share of the income, of the license revenue, for example, or equity. But for people who are not scientists but support staff, that's another question. So you have to have technology pipeline for the investments or acquisitions by either by equity or license. And for that you have to have research. So it all kind of grips itself in the tail. So access to risk capital from the outside is important. And also internal money is very, very important. So the proof of concept engine inside, which is basically an innovation engine inside the organization, will help push projects towards the market and de-risking them for later or pre-seed and seed capital investors. You need skills to properly present projects. This is something that has to be done as well. If you don't present right, even if the idea is good, then you get less interest. So again, the internal champions and counterparts in international networks. So there should be a lot of energy put into internationalization from universities, wherever you are. And we've talked about this today as well, I think, that everything is so global that you cannot just sit and look down in your table. You have to meet people, you have to explain what you're doing. So so you have to continuously build and maintain these relations that you have with international actors or collaborators. Okay, so here we come to the sleepy, snory slide. Normally it's cost. So, for example, as we heard also from the Innovation Fund in Denmark, it can be problems and nobody wants to hear about it, and it's seen as a obstacle and a barrier towards innovation, or some even Nobel Prize winners are saying this. But on the micro level, for me it's very interesting. It's very much a live animal that you have to deal with it somehow, because this is what companies are asking for. If they want to see somebody presenting an idea, they want to see do you have a monopoly on this, or are you just talking in general terms about something that you heard or read. When you have a patent application or a patent, you can actually show this is what it is. And okay, a patent has few readers, but the industry who would be interested are reading it very closely. So it's codified knowledge for them, which shows, it signals uniqueness. So also the economy, as it's developing, it's basically it's turning into the main asset of companies. as opposed to physical assets. So this is a growing trend, and it's going to keep on being like this. So as I said, it signals uniqueness of a product or service to the counterpart, whether it's a collaboration partner, or if it's industry who wants to acquire, or an investor. So, and what I was saying before, the function change, it started out as a monopolistic right where you forbid other people to exercise the invention. It then turned into a more strategic, well, it keeps all these traits, but then it transitioned into more of a strategic asset, how to tie people into you, how to tie specialized centers from, for example, Novo Nordisk. You have to show that you actually have something concrete. Then they will place a center at your premises. So it's a bargaining chip as well. So the changing role is also incorporating this new way for a company that has nothing else but intellectual property assets. There's now a push for a third way, which is neither well, it's a debt. If you use it as collateral, it's a debt instrument. You can get a loan with the IP as security. There's a new way also, which is neither equity or debt, which is basically an upfront payment. It's called basically securitization. It's not pure securitization. It's a pass-through. So Bowie did this with his music. He bunched all the songs together, and he sold the future revenues for an upfront payment, and that's copyright. But you can do the same thing for patents, and it's being done, especially in the US and Asia, Far East actually. TT proxies and indicators. So this is mainly my own stuff. So when I worked with researchers, or still working with the researchers actually, both at DTU and now at the JRC, these are things I look for. So are they interested in the patenting process? Do they have patents? Do they have publications? So, but patents in themselves are more proxies of innovation, because you can leave them lying in the drawer, which happens quite a lot. So then it's not innovation. It's an indication of invention. Okay, it's an invention. You've been recognized that you invented something, but if you don't make any effort, it's not going to end up on the market on its own, unless you're a very famous institute where people come, like the MIT. Software more and more supports patent or patented technologies. You see software everywhere. License deals are, for me, it's an indicator. But until the revenue comes, well, it's more of a proxy until the revenue comes. Then you can say it's actually had impact. Research excellence. This is where I don't know if it's wisdom or increasing laziness with age, but working with ERC grantees, for example, is very, very rewarding. They're doing blue sky research. They're top researchers, and more groundbreaking things come out of this blue sky, if something comes out that is applicable. So this is interesting. This is a strong one. Research collaborations with industry. I did this at DTU as well. So sometimes you have intellectual property emerging from these industrial PhDs. That happened several times. And so in collaborations like this, then everything is so focused and described, and it's very focused on problem solving. So it's bound to produce some good results. So that for me would be a good indicator that something is going on and should be looked out for from a business development perspective. Joint publications with industry. Now DTU, I'm mentioning DTU because I was working there for 7 years. This is a proxy, because it doesn't have to mean that you can put it on the marketplace afterwards. But it's a good indication at least. Market introduction. Well, if you have a license revenue, that's an indication of tech transfer having taken place. Startups and any societal impact that you can prove, even if it's a public authority, customs looking for example, false customs declarations. If it's applied, even if it doesn't give any money, it's tech transfer. So the incentives, yes. Public funding for this segment is deficient. EIB is working hard to make it better, and the EIF is rolling out instruments to do this, which is very, very good. So it's getting better, but otherwise, traditionally, it's been for research. Then you can maybe skew a part of the budget of the research to do tech transfer, but it doesn't really work. Dedicated TT financial instruments, I think there will be more in the future. They have to be more granular. So the one I mentioned before, the Western Balkans proof of concept, we're working on it now because we have the operative experience of POC. So I think we have to go in more granular. We have to look at sectors because they work differently. Pharma is hugely different from IT. So geography, you have to think about the specialization of the region, and also the political environment, plus a whole lot of other things. So industry funding, contract research, industry PhDs is important as well as a funding source. And their tech transfer takes place quite often. So as I said before about the POC, the inter-organizational innovation funding is, from my point of view, very, very important. Because then you can drive projects under the radar until they come to a place where the risk has been minimized, or it's been de-risked to the point that somebody else can take over, and the researcher doesn't have to quit the university and all these things. So, but it's important to keep in mind the projects, the applications have to be screened, so they're not used to top up research budgets, which can happen. Some researchers are really, really good at describing research as tech transfer. So. The proof of concept fund will also work as something that generates IP and needs TT capacity to build up. So yeah, it's basically an innovation engine within the university. This is so the question, of course, is how do you get the money for doing this? You can get regional money, private money in some from alumni. You can have it. The problem is that European Commission is not giving out much of this kind of. We should maybe in the next framework program. So we also did a recent survey with the TTO circle members, CERN and so forth, on incentives, and 90% of them, of the 27 respondents, have 90% of them have incentive systems. They target normally research, support staff, and reward innovation, research excellence, and general performance. And most of them also use a blend between recognition and a cut of the cake with a monetary wise. So, but it seems like from this study as well, it seems like recognition is the most important thing for researchers, to actually have a thank you note, or it's on the internet or in media. This is very important. So it's driven by creativity, and I don't think creativity can be paid to get better. Of course, it's nice with a check, but recognition is better. Okay, so just a few concluding remarks. Support from management is crucial to boost technology transfer. And here I also mean the management of a country. So from the highest political level, this is very important. And in a university, the university management has to be committed and interested in tech transfer to make it happen. Otherwise, it's a fight that takes a lot of energy and doesn't result in much. So you have to have the structured system for technology transfer, people who are skilled. You have to be able to identify the IP and all these things, and the money to do it. Relevant, good, and excellent research, and access to research infrastructure. By then meaning not just in the university, but Europe-wide or even internationally. If you know an instrument that you need to use in Japan, you should be able to. The technology pipeline is necessary, which comes from the research, and a strong IP position. Committed and skilled researchers and technicians. I put strong IP position twice. Okay, you have to retain and develop the value. You can't just let it lie. So if you have one patent, maybe you can patent around it. Maybe you can develop your product more or a service. And incentives need to be designed for different types of actors in the ecosystem. And here you have to know the ecosystem, and they look different from country to country. So you have to get into it. You have to get your hands dirty to be able to incentivize this, I think. So that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Engineers today, students in engineering, a student in medicines, are they sufficiently equipped in IPR rights? Are they trained in entrepreneurship? I mean, you taught me the other day the so-called entrepreneurial university. I mean, are students today equipped to go into the depth of findings, and once they have a finding, to seek IPR rights, and do they know how to about this concept of tech transfer, or can that be improved?
That can be improved everywhere, I think, but it's slowly trickling into the curriculum.